Welcome ladies to Monday. We have another beginning of another week in Season 1 of The War Within, and we are talking about the raid. We are talking about the difficulty of the raid, the progression of the raid, and asking ourselves the question: how many pulls do you want to see a raid last? Not just that, but on top of how long do you want the raid tier to be, there is also the question, how spread do you want these pulls? Do you want every boss in a 10 boss raid to be 50 pulls? Or do you want the first 5 bosses to be a one-shot and the last 5 bosses to be 100 pulls each, for example? Because we have now, with the end, of course, of the raid tier for the top guilds in Nerubar Palace, we have now the numbers of the progression of this raid. Things have gotten also even easier now with the nerfs given to the Silken Court and Ansurek. Remember, we had a video a week ago on the difficulty of this raid tier. Back then, right before, of course, Blizzard watched the video and then proceeded to nerf the bosses, we had about 55-ish kills of Silken Court. Now, today, we are up to 85 kills of the Silken Court. It got even larger of an improvement for Ansurek because we made this video right as the 10th guild killed Ansurek, and then in less than a week, in like 5 days, we went from 10 kills to 21. So, you know, big improvement in there as well, but actually, this raid, since Warlords of Draenor, so in a decade, and very likely, basically, since all of WoW, because the amount of pools have gone significantly up compared to older expansions. Since then, we now have Nerubar Palace as the third largest, longest type of raid in terms of pools required by the top guilds, world first kills in WoW. Now, there are only 2 raids being above Nerubar Palace right now. You will get bonus points if you can guess them correctly. They're quite simple, you know, a very specific raid, not even the last raid of an expansion, and then the last raid of one of the recent expansions. So, we're talking about, of course, Tomb of Sargeras in Legion with the small number of 1,248 pulls to clear the entire raid. And after that, only 24 pulls behind, you have Sepulchre. 1,224 pulls to clear the entire raid. Now, it is a big gap, it's above a 20% gap, but Nerubar Palace is now sitting in 3rd place with 1,003 pulls required to clear the entire raid. So, here is already the first question: is this too much? Is this too little? Or is this just right? Because of course, when you start comparing this to other raids, you might be surprised by how short, for example, certain raids have actually been in seasons. Because for example, this raid, Nerubar Palace, was 160 pulls longer for these level of guilds than Amir Jasil. I'm sure you all remember the difficulty, the progression the guilds were having on Tindral and then Ferak, but this raid tier was actually longer than both. However, you might have completely forgotten that Aberrus, the entire raid of Aberrus was 276 pulls. The entire raid of Aberrus took less than Nexus Princess Kaivesa for the top guilds this tier. It also took less, of course, than Tindral, it took less than Farak, it even took less than the Jailer, it took less than Alondrus, it took less than Stone Legion Generals in Castonatria. That's how badly undertuned Aberrus was. But even if we go before Aberrus into Vault of the Incarnates, Vault of the Incarnates was at a comfortable 464 wipes. That's less than half of the wipes of Nerubar Palace, barely more than half of the wipes of Amir Jasil. So that's a quite fast raid tier to be had. Now, obviously, the number of pulls in a raid is also relevant because it gives you an idea of how long are you going to be raiding. Obviously, if a raid only takes 300 wipes and another one takes 1,000, you can expect to be raiding almost 3 times as much in the longer raid tier. Now, obviously, these numbers come from world first level guilds. So obviously, we're not saying any of you was expected to one-shot Rashanan. Just like we're not saying any of you was expected to only take 2 wipes to kill Nimue and 3 wipes to kill Larodar. Obviously, the average wipes on Nimue was 20 to 30. For Larodar, it was 40 to 50. So obviously, the numbers are larger for the more average guilds, but still, it can give you an idea of the duration of a raid tier. Definitely, no matter if you were a mid-tier guild or a top guild or a barely cutting-edge guild, clearing a Mirjosil would have taken you more than clearing a Barus. Even at a lower level, the difficulty curve stays quite the same when it comes to bosses. So the question becomes, of course, how long do you want the raid to be? That's the first question we want to have. Do we want 500 wipes? Do we want 750? Do we want 1,000? More than 1,000? I am, to be fair, perfectly fine with the 1,000 pulls, 1,000 wipes as a benchmark, as a general number, especially if the balancing is correct. That's the other major point throughout a season. This season we have the catch-up mechanisms, the 2.25% more damage and healing week by week. Also, this season is much more slow to get yourself some gear, you know. Back in Aberus, for example, you were max item level 2 weeks in. Nowadays, you're still like 10 item levels below the max, even if right now you are 628 item level. So it's still much slower to become powerful this season, right? So I think 1,000 wipes, 1,000 pulls in a tier is okay. However, you have bigger questions than the total amount of pulls per raid. Because you know what's bad? You know what is going to burn players, give players the idea that the raid was a slog. The raid was boring. It was just soul draining. It's not actually the amount of pulls. Because, for example, talk about Tindral, right? Many players lost their sanity, their soul, and their will to live as they went through Tindral. But here's the thing. Mirjosil was still 160 wipes shorter than Nerubar Palace. Mirjosil was still not that drastically longer than Uldir, for example. So why is it that so many players just dislike the Mirjosil raid, the bottom half of the Mirjosil raid? That's because the wipes were way too concentrated on the last 2 bosses, right? 90%, over 90% of the wipes in Mirjosil were just on Tindral and Farak. That is where players get the idea that the raid is bad or boring or too long, because you get stuck on the same boss for too long. Part of the very good process that gets players into raiding, excited about the idea of raiding, is looking at the streams, at the VODs, at the replays of better guilds, top guilds progressing on the boss, to try to get some ideas, look at their strategies, start talking about the simulations for your character, about this damage profile you need to have on this boss. No, I can use my trinket and my cooldown on this timer for this ad, and then hold on a second, let's farm some keys to get this trinket because it's very good on this boss. Hold on a second, maybe I can reroll to my alt because it's better on this fight. It works if you can repeat this process on multiple bosses. So instead of having a single boss taking 400 wipes, if you had 4 different bosses taking 100 wipes each, it will feel, of course, much more refreshing as you go through this learning and min-maxing process on 4 different bosses, as opposed to just being stuck on the same one for weeks. Even though at the end, even though in these stat numbers of total pulls, it will read the same, one column will read 400 pulls, the other column will read 400 pulls, of course you had a much higher enjoyment in doing those 400 pulls across 4 different bosses. That is how you often change your perception on how you liked a raid, not because of how long it was or how short it was, but because of how many different challenging bosses you had to go through. Sometimes it can go overboard with this, because, for example, Sepulcher, technically speaking, Sepulcher is the best raid we ever had, possibly tied with Hellfire Citadel, in the variety of challenging bosses. Because Sepulcher, even for mid-tier guilds, for like good guilds, even Hall of Fame quality guilds, it had Lehuvim, it had Prototype Pantheon, it had Halondrus, Anduin, Lords of Dread, Rygalon, and Jailer. That's like 7 different bosses, 3 bosses around the 50 pool mark, and then 4 bosses well above close to 200 wipes each. So perhaps Sepulcher went slightly overboard with the difficulty on the amount of pulls in total. The same example can be said for what came after Tomb of Sargeras. Blizzard perhaps was a bit too scared on what they did in Tomb with the 1200 pulls and 1100 pulls just for the last 2 bosses of Tomb. They went the opposite way with Antorus, because they turned Antorus practically into a joke until the last boss. Another one of these examples was Nyalotha. Nyalotha was an undertuned raid where some of the last bosses you were expecting to be tough. So bosses like Carapace of N'Zoth, bosses like Raden, bosses like Vexiona were just a cakewalk. Very undertuned, and you only had 2 challenges, a decent one in Il'gynoth and then the other one in N'Zoth, in the entire raid tier, right? So overall, in terms of spread of difficulty throughout the bosses, this tier, Nerubar Palace, is amongst the better spreads, because we do have practically a perfect 50-50, because you have the first 4 bosses being very easy and then the last 4 bosses being much more challenging, right? Even nowadays we already have Pugs being able to get all the way up to 3 mythic boss kills already, but of course the quartet of Blood Twister into Nexus Princess into Silken Court into Ansurek is a very challenging set of bosses. So it's a lot of different bosses you get to learn, to try, and also one of the coolest things, of course, for raiders, which is the progress, right? Starting the night, trying to get past, an intermission, finishing the night with good progress, getting excited about the next chunk of progress you have to do. And this is always better if you get to do it on multiple bosses, rather than just one boss with a massive amount of pulls. So in terms of the spread of difficulty for bosses, this raid tier was very, very good. Imagine the disaster if Blood Twister was undertuned like Magmorax in Aberrus. And then also imagine if Nexus Princess was as undertuned as something like Larodar in Amir'Yassil. Then you would have, again, all of the pulls being focused on the last 2 bosses, which would have felt much worse for your experience in the raid. So we can say definitely the important thing isn't even how many pulls you want your raid to have. Once you get past a certain number, 7-ish hundred, if it's 800 or 9 or 1000 or even 1200 pulls, it doesn't really matter. What matters more is how are they spread. Is how many of the bosses you can go through the process which made you enjoy raiding, for example, which is the learning and the min-maxing and the progressing through a boss. If it happens to more bosses, then the better. If instead all of the pulls are just focused on 1 or 2 bosses at the very end of the raid, it will of course feel much worse. So we can definitely say in closing that this raid tier was actually good. Numbers at hand, numbers for the total pulls and the pulls by boss at hand, this raid was quite evenly spread in the last bosses. We haven't really seen this level of close balance in the challenge of the latter bosses since Sepulcher. Although Sepulcher, we can say, was a bit too over the top. You can also say Nerubar Palace initially was over the top, but it was adjusted quickly enough, at least more quickly than what we had in Sepulcher anyways, so it was more manageable and not nearly as outrageous. So actually, overall, the judgment of the first raid of the War Within is actually quite positive. Blizzard has fumbled before quite a few raids actually, because in Dragonflight you had Volt and Aberrus, which were quite big flops because both of them were below 500 pulls for the entire raid. Aberrus in particular was of course a massive mistake for Blizzard in terms of balancing. Before that even you had Sanctum, which was a very short raid, the biggest case of under-tuned later bosses, because of the last 3 bosses, 2 of them completely missed the mark. Guardian of the first ones and Kel'Thuzad combined didn't even survive 35 pulls for the top guilds. So that's how bad they were. But even tiers like Castelnatria, tiers like Nyalota had not been very successful in terms of balancing the bosses, because, you know, Nyalota, as mentioned, was very undertuned, except for a couple of bosses. You had Castelnatria, which was horribly tuned, but for the wrong reasons. You had Stone Legion generals being far overtuned, and then past them you had Denatrius, which was undertuned, severely undertuned compared to Stone Legion. But before Stone Legion you had Sludgefist, which was horribly tuned because it was a very simple boss, but with very high requirements of damage to be able to even kill the boss. So, you know, the track record of the balance of the raids throughout the last few years actually had not been too positive. You know, either there were blatant undertuned or overtuned bosses here and there in Nyalota, Castelnatria, or the undertuned Sanctum, overtuned Sepulchre, massively undertuned Volt and Aberrus. In Amirjasil things didn't get much better because now you still had the focus on the raids all at the bottom of the raid with Tindral and Ferak. Now with Nerubar Palace things did get much smoother in terms of the spread of difficulty throughout the bosses and being more evenly balanced in terms of challenge. So definitely a plus in terms of how the raid went out. As I said, perhaps a few more numbers could have been tweaked before the release of the raid in terms of difficulty, Nexus Princess and Broad Twister in particular. But besides that, it's an initial positive response for the state of the raid compared to the last few seasons, last few years even, we have had in terms of raid releases. So for today, on this Monday, this was our recap on how this first raid tier has looked like compared to the previous ones, practically the last decade worth of raid tiers. So for today, on this Monday, it is now time to leave each other. We are starting as usual the goodbyes by thanking everyone for having watched the video, as well as of course by supporting Competitive for free by liking and commenting down below, as well as subscribing to the channel itself. Now, with these things out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys tomorrow, and in the meantime, enough of waking up at 9 AM. You are 6 hours ahead of schedule.